Kenner presents new alien action figure.
Maintenance flow! Quick, shut the L off! The alien's locked out now! He got through! Shh! Give up! Alien can't be beat! We'll zap him with the light! Don't, he'll destroy the spaceship! We've lost! Better find another ship! Let's try the kitchen! Another triumph for Alien!
Alien action figure, new from Kenner.
These days, it's no big deal for action figures to be based on decidedly adult content. After all, the main audience for a lot of these models are now grown adults with the need to relive their childhood, fill their home with collectible items, or just revel in the sheer inappropriateness of having toys based on ultra-violent movies. But back in 1979, everything was a lot simpler. Toys were for kids, and that was that. At that time, 20th Century Fox and Kenner Toys were raking money in hand over fist from Star Wars toy sales, a seemingly endless collection of merchandise that would make even more money than the films themselves. Foremost amongst these toys were the action figures and related accessories, a collection that effectively reinvented the concept in terms of size and expansiveness. The smaller, and so slightly more affordable Star Wars figures meant that kids would buy the whole set, and even purchase multiple versions of characters like Imperial Stormtroopers. It was a money-making machine that seemed to have no end, with ever more obscure characters added with each collection and each film. Of course, most of Fox's share of those fast riches was going straight to George Lucas, who we have to credit with having the foresight to see the possibilities in what increasingly became a 2-hour commercial for merchandise, and who made a deal to retain all the merch rights. So you can't blame Fox for wanting to repeat that bonanza and this time actually keep the money. Luckily for them, they had another big sci-fi blockbuster lined up that offered all manner of merchandising opportunities. At least it did in theory. Unfortunately, Alien was not Star Wars. Star Wars was a family-friendly, wholesome movie that stood out because it was so removed from the cynical, violent and adult-oriented films that dominated the 1970s. Alien, on the other hand, was an adults-only R-rated movie full of gore, tension and what the British censors would call adult situations. It had more in common with The Exorcist than The Empire Strikes Back, and was more a terrifying horror movie than a Disney-esque space opera. The film was a massive box office hit and a very big deal, but it wasn't really something that was being seen by kids. And it had a monster that no one was allowed to see photos of until the movie was well into release. I remember that when the first Alien tie-in books to actually show photos of the monster appeared, it was seen as quite a big thing, and probably something that the sci-fi magazines of the era felt rather bitter about. Even the official movie poster magazine couldn't show the image of the alien until its second issue. But once that monster did enter the public domain and began appearing on the covers of every sci-fi mag out there, kids were understandably very excited by a monster that was the coolest looking creature imaginable. Given that it was still essentially a man in a suit, it's hard to imagine just how revolutionary the alien was at the time. But even the biggest budget science fiction films of the era still featured very average looking monsters on the whole. And while alien creatures had become decidedly less scary in the post-Star Wars era, this monster looked genuinely otherworldly and, well, alien. Just because kids couldn't see the film didn't mean that they were unaware of it. As essentially the first really big science fiction film since Star Wars and Close Encounters of the Third Kind, it was given saturation coverage in all the genre magazines of the time, and while underage viewers couldn't enjoy the actual movie, they could buy both the photo novel and the heavy metal graphic novel adaptation. Sci-fi loving kids were still alien mad and keen to gobble up as much about the movie as they could. So a toy range wasn't quite as mad as it might seem. In theory, it wasn't that removed from the classic monster toys, which were, after all, based on horror films. Admittedly, horror films that were now decades old and had become familiar through TV broadcasts where kids had seen them, and through the general sanitization of the monsters involved. Still, you can see the logic at work in figuring out that kids would love alien toys. It wasn't a toy-friendly narrative by any stretch of the imagination. But there was the board game, because that probably makes a certain sense, and a target shooting game, which I suppose also makes a certain sense, though I'm guessing wasn't all that entertaining. What the kids obviously really wanted was an Alien action figure, and that's what they got. Unfortunately, the figure that came out was a touch too realistic. As mentioned earlier, the Star Wars action figures had pioneered the switch to 4-inch dolls from the previous norm of 8-inch Mego figures and the 12-inch G.I. Joes and Action Man. Smaller figures allowed more vehicles and playsets that were less expensive, a selling point for parents, and less space gobbling, a selling point for kids who would at best have one room to call their own, assuming that they weren't sharing with a sibling. But the Alien figure decided to go the other way. It came in at an extravagant 18 inches. 1.5 feet. That's almost as tall as some of the kids who it was being marketed at, for crying out loud. It was, admittedly, an impressive beast. Closer, perhaps, to the intricate figures of today than the more basic toys of the time. But that didn't really work in its favour. Parents understandably balked at a giant grotesque monster with an uncomfortably sexual and needlessly luminous head, taken from a film that was being hyped as the most terrifying thing ever made. Worse still, this was a monster that would shoot out an even more phallic mini-head. Hell, let's call it a tongue, where little Johnny pushed the head down. There was something unsavoury about the Alien toy, and the sheer size of the damn thing was just the icing on the cake. The writing had perhaps already been on the wall that Alien and kids were a difficult combination. In Britain, the aforementioned graphic novel from Heavy Metal had caused parental outrage that the tabloids quickly picked up on. British people still thought that comics were strictly for kids, and here was a publication that was sold with no age restrictions and featured graphic scenes of violence, much more extravagant in style than was in the actual film, and, even worse, bad language. Futura Books, the UK publishers of the book, were forced to quickly add warning labels and age restrictions. Parents, at least a certain type of parent, were not happy about this unsavoury film being pushed at kids in any way, shape or form. US sales on the Alien doll were rather poor, to the surprise of no one except Kenner and 20th Century Fox. However, this wasn't due to a massive campaign against it, as you might think. Parents had written letters of complaint, but in those pre-social media days, an actual boycott was a little harder to organise. No one stepped up to head a campaign against the figure in the way that happened with some other ill-considered toys that we'll probably explore in future videos. But equally, no one seemed keen to buy the doll. They quickly started gathering dust on the shelves before Kenner admitted defeat and pulled it from the market, cancelling plans for a full line of figures. It would be several years and a cultural shift towards adult collectors before Alien got another chance in the toy market. As you might expect, the original Alien figure is now highly collectible. Do you have one? What did you think of it at the time? What do you think of it now? Let us know in the comments. And if this kind of historical documentary is your thing, then why not give it a like and subscribe to the Overlooked Hotel to make sure that you don't miss any of our future videos or indeed our past videos. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again soon.